Hello, and welcome back to Things I Want My Kids to Know with me, Ted Bradshaw. This is the podcast where I talk about the things as a therapist and as a person that I would want my kids to know as they grow. I don't want anybody to know, but particularly the people that are most important to me. Today, I want to talk to you about something that I think is really important and absolutely central to pretty much any work that I do with any therapy client. And also something that's really on my mind as a parent that I would want for my children, but which is potentially really boring. And I don't mean it is boring. I think we're gonna have a really interesting time here, but it's not one of those things. I think a lot of the time we're, particularly maybe it's social media, kind of looking for quick things. What can I do to manage my mental health? What's the quickest thing? What's the one piece of advice? And actually, the thing we're going to talk about is finding peace in the middle ground, or with flexibility towards yourself. And what I mean by that is at the extremes of things, so having really high expectations of yourself, or perfectionism, having the expectation you're going to get everything correct, or indeed people pleasing, wanting to not let anybody down, wanting to make sure that everybody is okay. Being at the extreme end of something can be very stressful. It can bring a lot of positive qualities too, like having high expectations is not a bad thing. Wanting everybody to be happy is not a bad thing. Or if we take an anxiety example, let's say health anxiety, wanting to be vigilant for symptoms in your body, which might be a sign of something wrong, is not inherently a bad thing. But when it's taken, to 100%, I must always be vigilant for every single symptom. It can mean that you're just constantly bombarded and constantly stuck in this place where you kind of can't do anything else. But the difficulty is that sometimes trying to make any changes about that can mean that it can feel like you're being asked to ping right over the other way. So somebody with perfectionist tendencies, knowing that that's getting in their way, one of the barriers for them to do anything about it can be, well, yeah, but if you're asking me to do something at 95%, what it feels like is you may as well ask me to do it at 0%. Or somebody who edges towards the people-pleasing side of things, maybe they might feel very uncomfortable practicing letting people down or practicing saying no, because the feeling of somebody else potentially being off with me is so uncomfortable that it feels like I'm being rude, or it feels like you're asking me to kick them in the shins. Like, never mind just asking me to just say no or express my opinion. So that is what can keep you really stuck. Or with health anxiety, if we take that example again, saying to somebody, okay, well, it looks like being so vigilant for all of these symptoms is really getting in your way. It's really exhausting, and it means that while you might feel safer from missing something, it's also costing you a lot in your life. How is somebody immediately going to get their head around the idea of, or accept the idea that maybe I need to be less vigilant? That sounds really scary. If ultimately the thing that you are afraid of is, if I am not vigilant all the time, something will slip through the net and that will cause me catastrophic harm. It's not going to be that easy. It's just not going to be that easy. So there's loads to talk about within this, but the key principle is finding some flexibility can be really useful. We're going to go through a few examples. I'm going to talk about practically what can you do to help yourself with some of this stuff. What does the middle ground mean? And I suppose a starting point is that the middle ground doesn't have to be in the middle. What we're aiming for is slightly more flexibility. So, for example, somebody with perfectionist tendencies, you don't have to become somebody who now, is fine with sort of 50% if that's the middle ground. Actually, what might help you is if you keep those standards in some ways and in some areas of your life, but you allow yourself a little bit more flexibility in other areas of your life. It might be as small as, I'm allowed to do the washing up 75%. That doesn't have to be 100%. I am allowed to do my hobbies in a way that is not about performance and perfection. I am allowed to misspell things occasionally in places where it doesn't have a consequence for my life. It's not about becoming somebody completely the opposite. Part of the reason this topic has been on my mind to do something about is because somebody sent me a question. pod@cbtted.co.uk is where you can send your questions. And this person said, we talk a lot about the consequences of being a perfectionist or of being a people pleaser, but what we don't talk a lot about is the consequences of being somebody the opposite end of that scale. So what's at the opposite end of being a people pleaser? It would be somebody that doesn't care about anybody else's feelings and only thinks of themselves first. That would be the exact opposite. That would be 0% if super people pleasing is 100%, for example. Or in perfectionism, that if at one end of the scale is I have to get everything right all the time, 100% perfect, at the opposite end of that scale is no standards at all. And again, if we take an anxiety example, if being vigilant for absolutely everything all the time is at one end of the scale, then never paying attention to anything that might be a problem would be at the opposite end of the scale. And we can see that isn't desirable either, really. Maybe there's elements of it. So what would be beneficial about being somebody with no standards at all? What would be beneficial about that? Probably they're going to be pretty chilled out. No problem. But there might be consequences too. Maybe they're quite hard to live with or to work with. Maybe actually some of the things they'd quite like in their life they don't get because actually they don't put the effort in. They don't have the expectations, so they don't push for things. So maybe that isn't somebody we want to be. But maybe we'd like to pinch a bit of it. Maybe I'd quite like to be able to just relax a little bit more. Or if it was people pleasing, what's at the opposite end of that scale? Well, somebody that doesn't care about anybody's feelings at all. Again, they're probably quite chilled out because they're in their own little bubble. But there are consequences. People might not like them. People might not want to hang around with them quite so much. Maybe it doesn't work out perfectly for them. But the point is, in order to live your life in a way that feels less stressful, you don't have to become the entire opposite of what you are now. Just finally, with that vigilance example, what would be the pros and cons of being somebody that just doesn't pay any attention to possible danger at all? Again, pretty chilled out. But maybe they will miss things. Maybe things will happen because they're not on the lookout. On the other hand, maybe they are really able to enjoy the moment because they are just thinking about the now. They're not really thinking about what comes next. And maybe that's just something you want to pinch a bit of. We're going to talk more about this kind of spectrum idea and the two kind of extremes of the scale not being very helpful, but maybe there's some flexibility somewhere in the middle. But first of all, let's just talk about what some of the consequences can be of having very extreme expectations of yourself. So one way we can think about this is a path. So if you have picked up along the way that the way to feel secure and safe is to meet these particular expectations. So I must get absolutely everything right, or I must never let anybody down, or I must be vigilant for absolutely everything. Then this is like walking a very tight, very narrow path that feels like it kind of has cliffs either side of it. Because it's so tight and so narrow, it requires a lot of concentration to make sure you're sticking on the path. You can't just have a little chat with people while you're walking along. You just have to concentrate on where you're walking. That can be tiring after a while, but also you might constantly be feeling like you're just about to tip off it, or maybe you're constantly feeling that you are stepping off it, because if your expectations are so high, then it doesn't really matter how hard you work. You're always going to feel like it's not quite enough. So it can feel stressful. There might be times when you do feel good, but it's only when you're sticking to the path, and sticking to the path is tiring and potentially even exhausting. And maybe quite lonely, actually. Whereas, if we have a slightly more flexible path, something with a little bit more wiggle room, so my examples would be, with a perfectionist type thing, it'd be something like standards are important, and it's important to try and do well, but it's okay for some things to just be all right. And it is absolutely okay to fail at some things and to be a bit rubbish at some things. If it's new things, or even if it's stuff you already know, people make mistakes. It is okay to do that. Let's make space for some learning. Then maybe if you're trying to walk that path, it doesn't require quite as much concentration. You're still thinking about where you're putting your feet. You still want to do the right thing, but you don't have to think so hard about whether every step you're making is okay. And maybe you don't constantly feel like you're about to fall off a cliff. Maybe instead you feel like, oh, okay, I've stepped a little bit too far out of this, but it's okay. I can just step back on again. So maybe you're not as on edge all the time. Similarly, with people pleasing, if we take that example, I must always keep everybody happy. I must never let anybody down would be an example of a very narrow, very rigid path. And another kind of consequence of this, I suppose, is this is a really good example of an expectation of yourself that isn't entirely in your control. You're not in charge of how other people respond. You're not in charge of how other people feel. So even if you've done the right thing, they might not feel that you have. So you might let people down even though you are trying not to. You might have people that are upset with you even though you've worked so hard to make sure that everything's okay. So trying to walk that path can be absolutely exhausting. Something specific here, well, I suppose it does apply to perfectionism too, but particularly in people pleasing, is you have to completely forget your own needs, actually. So in order to make sure that you're keeping everybody else happy, that requires sacrifice of your own needs. Sometimes that's true in perfectionism too. In, the sort of outcome, the output, my performance is more important than the fact that I'm tired, or the fact that I need a bit of a break, or the fact that I'm just not at 100% today. Similarly, in people pleasing, your needs are absolutely irrelevant. And that can lead you to actually feel resentful. So trying to walk this path can be really hard. A more flexible path might be something like, it's important to be a nice person and to offer help when you can, and to try your best to make sure that the people who deserve it and the people around you get the attention they need. But don't forget that you are a person too, and you are included in that. You are no better and no worse than anybody else, which means that you deserve the exact same treatment. No more, no less. Maybe that means and gives you enough flexibility to be able to say, okay, well, I can think about what other people want, but it's also okay for me to say what I want. It is okay for me to get what I want, even if somebody else doesn't want it sometimes. Much like I would feel it is okay for somebody else to get what they want sometimes when I don't particularly want that. It will be back and forth. It will be fairer. It will be more balanced. And it leaves a lot more wiggle room. It means that maybe if somebody is a little bit off with me, or somebody does seem to be a little bit put out by what I've said, but what I've said I feel is reasonable, maybe I don't have to worry about it. Maybe it's okay for me to be allowed to do that. That's what we mean by flexibility. Finally, if we go back to this sort of anxious example, so if it's I've got to be vigilant for every possible problem at all times and I must not let up, that's really hard. It's really exhausting. It's very difficult for you to enjoy your life. Very difficult to do that. But it feels scary to let go of some of that. But we don't want you to become somebody that's not vigilant for anything. We don't want you to become somebody that never pays attention to your body, never locks the front door, never thinks about your finances. We just want a little bit of flexibility. So a flexible approach to that might be something like, it's useful to be vigilant and to be aware. However, you don't have to do that every second of every day in order to have taken reasonable precautions. It's important to take reasonable precautions, and sometimes there will be times in your life where you need to be even more vigilant than usual. So, as an example, I'm a bloke and I'm coming into my 40s. It is now going to be even more important for me to pay attention to my prostate, for example. And that maybe it is okay to dial it up and dial it down sometimes. That is another thing to do with flexibility as well. it is okay for you to use this tendency that you have for your own advantage. You do not have to get rid of it. You can choose to dial it up and down. That is true flexibility. That I am allowed to really let my perfectionism off the leash. I can just really let it go for it when it's appropriate, when it's really helpful to me. So I've got a project and I want to make it the best that I possibly can. I will let my perfectionism off the leash. When I'm at home and my kids are sort of messing around with stuff and I'm finding it really stressful, maybe here's where I give myself a little bit of permission for the house not to be perfect. And maybe that works better for me. That kind of thing. People pleasing. Maybe I can choose to really be kind and really help somebody out when I really want to. And there are times in my life when I might also choose to dial up the idea that it is okay for me to have wants too. And I might choose to go up and down with that. That's okay. That's what flexibility means. I want to do one more little bit on why this is so important. Sometimes when you're really at the top end, when you're really at the extreme, the thing you are trying to do doesn't work anymore. So let's take them one by one again. Perfectionism, if you're trying to get absolutely everything 100% right, you will be incredibly slow. Just so slow, because you'll be overthinking absolutely everything. Every little bit that somebody gives you, you'll be double checking, triple checking. You'll be overdoing every single bit. That will exhaust you, and because you're exhausted, it is going to be quite difficult for you to work at your best, and you are trying to work at your best. And what do? Because you feel exhausted, you work even harder, you work even later. What does that do? It makes you even more tired. Actually, in trying to get everything perfect, it is possible that wasn't the expectation of everybody else. It's possible it wasn't necessary for you, but in trying to get everything perfect, you've ended up missing the point. Sometimes when it feels so important to get everything perfectly right, another thing that you can end up doing is putting off the important projects because they're too intimidating, they're too scary. I know this is going to be really hard and I don't know how to make it perfect, so instead I'll concentrate on the quick wins that I can do and on these little projects that don't actually matter. That can be hard as well. In trying to get everything 100% right, you can end up going the opposite way. That can be a useful way in to think about. It might be helpful to me to develop some flexibility so that I can use my tendency to want to get things right for the right things. I can prioritize things. Similarly with people pleasing. So if you're trying to make everybody happy, sometimes the inevitable consequence of that is that you can't. If two people want two different things, you can't keep them both happy. And if you are trying to do so, you can tie yourself up in knots. But also, it can cause some friction in relationships when your needs are completely irrelevant. Because the other person in that dynamic, if they're a nice person and they want the best for you as well, they want you to be happy. They want you to be well. And it's hard for them if you're constantly not telling them what you want. That can be difficult, actually. Also, in trying to keep everybody happy, sometimes you end up having people in your life who aren't very nice. Because if you have a more flexible approach, it's okay, it's important for me to be nice, but I'm important too. It's easier for you to have some boundaries, like this person doesn't treat me very well, so actually I don't need to be super nice to them. Maybe I just kind of avoid them a bit. Whereas if you are a super duper people pleaser, if you like, at the high end of the scale, somebody being off with you all the time will be excruciating, and your response to that will be, I'll try and keep them happy. I'll chase after them, actually. And you end up spending more time on quite nasty people than you do on people that are kind and accept you for who you are, because those people aren't off with you, so they're not a problem. Similarly with when you're anxious about stuff. So if we take the health anxiety example, like why would we be so invested in trying to make sure that we've seen every symptom? And it's because the idea of missing a symptom and becoming really ill or dying is really scary. And why is that scary? Sometimes it's because the idea of those things in themselves are scary, but sometimes we're scared about missing out, or we're scared about suffering. But the problem is, when you are constantly attending to those things, you're constantly vigilant, you're already suffering. And you're already missing out. There isn't any space for you to enjoy life or relationships. You're missing out. It isn't that we want you to become somebody that doesn't care about that at all. What we do want is a bit of flexibility so that you have a little bit of space. A little bit of space for your life. A little bit of space for your life. That's the rationale for wanting some flexibility, for wanting a little bit more of the middle ground. But what about how do you do that? Let's talk about how do you do that. And I want to be really clear that it's not always easy. But the way that I would put this is we go back to the path example. So, for whatever reason, if your mind has picked up that you have to be this way, you have to get everything 100% right, or you have to keep absolutely everybody happy, or you have to be vigilant all the time, to go against that will feel physically uncomfortable. And that might be quite hard to understand from the outside, or maybe even for you. So somebody who's at the quite extreme end of people pleasing, for example, might really find it hard to just say what they want for dinner, or to say what they'd like to watch on telly tonight, because it feels to them that they're being selfish, or they're encroaching, or they're putting somebody else at a disadvantage in some way, or being selfish. Or a perfectionist being asked to just make a small spelling error in an email that doesn't mean anything. That might feel physically uncomfortable. How I would express that is, why does that happen, is this path has been picked up as this is how I keep safe. This is how I keep my place in the group. I am either valued for this, or it is dangerous to do the opposite. It's dangerous to let people down. It's dangerous to not get everything correct. Or I am valued for being the one that gets things right. I am valued for being the one who is nice to everybody. So I need to keep doing this. And how your body will kind of react if you try and go against it is, this isn't safe. This isn't safe. So it will set off the anxiety response in your body, which will push you back to doing the same thing again. So what we want is to gradually show your body we can take a step off this path and we don't get eaten. This is the path of safety. Beyond the borders of this path, what your brain feels like is there's dinosaurs or tigers out in the jungle. And what we want to show it is, no, you can take a step off and you still won't get eaten. This kept us safe for a while, but we don't need to do it anymore. Not all the time. And I don't have to become somebody that I don't like in order to do things that are helpful for me. So it would be choosing small things. For example, well, first it would start with, where do you want to be able to get to? What does a middle ground look like? Do you know anybody that's got a good balance? For example, in perfectionism, do you know anybody that's got a good balance between high standards but being able to prioritize that and dial it up and down? Do you know anybody in people pleasing that is kind and good to other people but can also kind of look after themselves too? Do you know anybody that can do that? With anxiety, do you know anybody that strikes a good balance between being vigilant and not being kind of irresponsible, but is able to maybe put that down at times? Do you know anybody like that? What do they do? How do they do it? Genuinely, ask those questions if you can. And then think about, well, if I was just going to take one step towards the middle ground, I don't have to make a big leap. I don't have to do something completely outside of my comfort zone, just something that's just on the edge of my comfort zone, or something just one step beyond. And can I try that? For perfectionism, that might be practicing making little mistakes or leaving little mistakes. For people pleasing, it might be saying what you want in low stakes environments. So at home, just saying a little bit more about what you want, even if you know that might not be what somebody else wants. And in anxiety, it might be about practicing not being quite as vigilant. So if you were to check, for example, your symptoms in your body 10 times in a day, why don't we try 9? Let's see if we can do 9. Let's see if we can leave it 15 minutes before you check again. The urge rises. Let me see if I can just leave it 15 minutes before I check that symptom again. And the more you practice it, the more tolerable that becomes, until eventually it becomes something you can handle. And you are gradually widening your path. There is more that you can handle, and you don't have to stick to this very narrow, very rigid set of things. The final thing I want to say is this is on my mind as a parent. So I know that I'll be giving my kids all sorts of stuff. So, and particularly about the people pleasing thing, like be nice. Like be nice to each other is the thing that comes out of my mouth all the time. And maybe they'll pick up from me being a bit of a people pleaser myself that is the right way to be. I can't help that. I have to get them to be nice to each other. You can't be hitting each other. Don't do that. But what I want is for them to have some flexibility. What I want by the time they are grown is something along the lines of, it is important to be considerate of others, but you are a person too, and it's important to be considerate of yourself as well. It's useful and helpful to have standards and try your best at certain things, but it's also important to give yourself a break and to choose when you put all your effort in and when you don't. That's the ideal. I'm not saying I'm going to make it there, but it does take a bit of the pressure off, I think, as a parent, to just sort of say, I don't have to get this right. I just want some flexibility. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for listening. If you want a little bit more, there's plenty more. So first of all, there's a couple of bonus episodes on people pleasing and on perfectionism in my back catalogue in the sort of bonus episodes for paid subscribers. It's $3.50 a month, or you can get a discount for a year. And then the second thing is I go over this principle in my course, CBT Tools for Coaches, which is there for helping professionals of all varieties if they want to learn a few CBT skills. This idea of helping somebody find some flexibility is an absolutely central part of that. I run it a couple of times a year, and I'll be running it again in September this year, which is 2026. And you can find all the details for all of that in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.